finds exhausted housekeeper asleep. The billionaire CEO made her an offer that would change her life. Sophie Bennett never imagined that one simple mistake would change her life forever. After working 3 exhausting shifts, she fell asleep on the couch in the penthouse of Alexander Carter, the billionaire CEO she had never even noticed before. But when he found her, something shifted. Instead of firing her, he saw something in her, something raw, real. And just like that, Sophie was no longer just a housekeeper. She was about to step into a world of power, secrets, and a future she never saw coming. The city skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Carter's penthouse suite. The vast expanse of glass framed the lights of the city below, yet the powerful CEO barely noticed. His mind was still occupied with the deals, the numbers, and the high-stakes decisions of the day. He had just returned from a grueling business trip, one that had drained him more than he cared to admit. The kind of trip that left you longing for nothing more than a quiet evening to decompress. But as he stepped into his suite, with its sleek modern furnishings and the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air, he realized that peace was not to be found in the stillness of the room. Alexander tossed his suit jacket onto the chair and loosened his tie, running a hand through his dark, slightly disheveled hair. The weight of his responsibilities, the burden of overseeing one of the largest investment firms in the country, was never far behind. Yet tonight, something about the atmosphere in the room was different. It wasn't just the towering piles of paperwork, the ringing of his phone, or the buzzing of emails that filled his day-to-day life. It was something else entirely. He paused. There, curled up on the plush leather couch near the minibar, was a woman fast asleep. Alexander's sharp blue eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp, his curiosity piqued. It was a rare thing for someone to be in his suite without him knowing, and yet this woman wasn't an intruder. He recognized the worn uniform she wore, the apron still loosely tied around her waist. She was one of the housekeepers, he realized. Why was she here? His gaze softened as he studied her. She wasn't just resting, she was exhausted. Her arms were tucked beneath her head, her breathing slow and steady. Dark strands of hair had fallen across her face, and her uniform bore faint smudges of cleaning detergent. A small tray with an untouched cup of coffee rested on the table beside her. She must have dozed off while working. Alexander's first instinct was to wake her, but something stopped him. Something about the way she looked, so drained, as though she had given every last bit of energy she had and had finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion. For a man who was used to people constantly working to impress him, this was something different, something real. She wasn't trying to impress him, she wasn't trying to be anyone other than herself. There was no polished performance, no facade. It was the raw, unfiltered version of a woman who worked hard, maybe too hard, and had reached the point of utter exhaustion. His mind wandered for a moment. He was used to control, to people bending to his will with a single word. He ran one of the most powerful companies in the country. Yet, in his own penthouse suite, here was something he couldn't control. A woman, a simple housekeeper, sleeping as if the weight of the world had finally taken its toll on her. Alexander exhaled, rubbing his jaw. He had never taken the time to really notice the people who worked for him, never paid attention to the details of their lives. But now, standing here in the quiet, his mind racing, something tugged at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than he could see at first glance. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into an armchair, still watching her. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was Daniel, his personal assistant, sending over the updated schedule for the next day. The usual grind board meetings, lunches with investors, dinner reservations. But Alexander wasn't focused on any of that right now. Instead, he found his gaze once again drifting back to Sophie. Sophie. That was her name, he realized. He quickly accessed the hotel's internal records, his fingers flying over the iPad screen. Sophie Bennett, age 26, no criminal record, employed here for the past 2 years. Something tugged at him again. 2 years in this place meant she had cleaned his suite before. He had never noticed her, never once taken the time to appreciate the small, painstaking details of his stay. The perfectly folded towels, the spotless floors, the fresh coffee, the way everything was always in place when he returned. And yet now, as he stared at her, he realized he had never even considered who had been behind those details. Alexander's thoughts were interrupted when Sophie stirred slightly, her face scrunching in her sleep, and then she shifted again, curling into herself more tightly. It was in that moment that he saw it, a flicker of vulnerability, a brow furrowed in sleep, but there was something about it that struck a chord with him. What kind of life did she live that she worked herself to the bone like this? He stood up, taking a step toward her, but he didn't wake her. Instead, he watched. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, but he couldn't help but feel that there was something important here. Something about Sophie that called to him. The sound of her breathing slowed, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Alexander wasn't sure what to make of any of it. There was no logic here, no clear reason why he felt compelled to stay. He was the CEO of Carter Enterprises. He had the world at his feet. Yet, standing here in the silence of his penthouse, watching Sophie Bennett sleep, it was clear that the world he had built wasn't as fulfilling as he thought. And so, instead of waking her, instead of doing what he might have done in the past, something transactional, something dismissive, he let her sleep. He stood there for a long time, contemplating. She had no idea that her life was about to change. She had no idea that this night would mark the beginning of something new, something that would take her far from where she had started. It wasn't about the power he wielded, the wealth he accumulated, or the empire he had built. No, it was about something much more unexpected. It was about her. Sophie Bennett, the housekeeper who had never meant to be noticed, and yet she was. And now everything was about to change. For both of them. Finally, when the silence became too heavy to bear, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He needed to offer her something, a chance to change her life, just as she had unknowingly changed his. As he watched her sleep, he knew that this wasn't just a simple act of kindness. This was something bigger, an opportunity that would reshape both their futures. He stood there a moment longer, making sure the decision was right, and then, when Sophie finally stirred awake, he made his move. "Come back tomorrow," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sophie froze, blinking at him in confusion. She stammered out an apology, but he simply shook his head. "Not as a housekeeper," he clarified. "I want to talk to you." And with that, everything changed. Section 1. The beginning of something unexpected. Sophie's mind was foggy as she slowly woke up, the warmth of the couch beneath her body tugging her back into slumber. She fought the urge to close her eyes again, a wave of exhaustion sweeping over her as she tried to orient herself. But then the reality of the situation hit her like a bucket of ice water. The soft click of a door closing, the faint creak of leather beneath her, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. She froze. The first thing she noticed was the sharp voice, low and calm, but unmistakably authoritative. "You fell asleep," Alexander Carter said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to command. Sophie's eyes shot open, her pulse quickening as she scrambled to sit up, her uniform crinkling as she straightened herself. The first thing she saw were his blue eyes, piercing and unreadable, watching her with quiet scrutiny. "Oh my God," she gasped, her heart racing. She couldn't believe this. How had she ended up here? How long had she been asleep? She scrambled for an explanation, but her words came out in a jumbled mess. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to—" "Relax," Alexander interrupted, his tone steady. There was something strange in the way he spoke, almost like he wasn't angry, but rather observing her. "You're tired." Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She was tired, yes. Exhausted even. It was the third shift of the day, and there was no room for error when she worked. But this? Sleeping in the penthouse suite of one of the wealthiest men in the country? It wasn't just unusual, it was shocking. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, her voice shaky as she looked around. The luxurious penthouse was like something out of a dream, with sleek furniture, polished marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering city lights. It wasn't just the extravagance of the— "Take a seat," Alexander said, his voice gentle but firm. Sophie hesitated, still standing by the couch, unsure if she had any right to remain in such an opulent space. But his command left her little choice. She slowly sank back into the couch, her body sagging with fatigue, and instinctively, she reached for the untouched cup of coffee on the table, hoping it would bring some clarity to her foggy mind. Alexander, meanwhile, poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into the nearby armchair. He didn't say anything for a moment, simply watching her. His sharp eyes seemed to assess her every move, but not in the usual way she had seen in guests before. This wasn't the cold, impersonal stare of someone who paid for her services. This was different. It was almost as though he were studying her, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, not sure whether to speak or remain silent. The weight of his gaze felt like it was pressing into her, and she couldn't help but wonder what he saw in her. She wasn't glamorous or polished like the women he likely spent time with. She wasn't rich or important. She was just a woman who worked hard to make ends meet. Someone who had spent countless hours cleaning up after people who never noticed the small details. The spotless floors, the perfectly folded towels, the fresh coffee in the mornings. No one ever noticed her, let alone looked at her like this. Her mind raced as Alexander leaned back in his chair, the soft click of his glass filling the silence. He wasn't in a hurry to speak. He wasn't angry, and for some reason that only made Sophie more nervous. What was he thinking? Why had he stopped to observe her like this? What was she supposed to do? "You work hard," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet edge to it. Sophie blinked, unsure of where this conversation was headed. She was barely holding it together, but there was something in his tone that made her instinctively lower her guard. "I have to," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no self-pity in her words, just a blunt honesty that she wasn't used to sharing. She had learned long ago not to complain. She worked hard because it was the only way to survive. No one else was going to pay her rent, no one else would cover the bills, and at the end of the day, that was all that mattered. Alexander studied her for a long moment. "How much do they pay you?" he asked, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. Sophie stiffened, but only for a second. She wasn't ashamed of her job, even if it didn't come with the glamour or perks of Alexander's world. "Enough," she said firmly, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't lying, at least not in the way people usually lied to protect their pride. But enough had never been enough. She barely scraped by each month, and the constant pressure weighed on her like an unrelenting storm. But what could she do? She had no other option. Alexander didn't respond immediately. He studied her, his gaze unreadable. Sophie began to feel self-conscious, unsure of why she was even sharing this with him. This wasn't a conversation she should be having with the CEO of Carter Enterprises. She wasn't a part of his world. She was a mere housekeeper, a cog in the machine, a nameless face in a sea of others. Yet, something told her that this wasn't like any other situation she had ever found herself in. Alexander's presence was commanding, but there was something different about him. He wasn't like the other wealthy men she had encountered in the course of her work. Distant, self-absorbed, entitled. No, there was something far more enigmatic about him, something that made Sophie feel as if she were on the edge of something she couldn't quite grasp. Sophie's thoughts were interrupted when Alexander stood up, his movements precise and deliberate. He walked toward her, his gaze never leaving hers, and Sophie felt her heart begin to race. She wasn't sure why, but she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. "I want to make you an offer," Alexander said suddenly, his voice low and steady. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. An offer? What did he mean by that? She blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What kind of offer?" she asked, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to remain composed. Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply watched her, as though weighing her every reaction. Sophie waited, her hands gripping the edge of the couch, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't a situation she had prepared for. She had spent her life cleaning up after the rich and powerful, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined being on the other side of the equation. "I need a personal assistant," he said finally, his voice cool and businesslike. Sophie's stomach twisted at the words, and she froze. A personal assistant? To him? "You're smart, hard-working," he continued. "I can see that, and I need someone I can trust." Sophie's mind raced, but all she could do was stare at him, unsure of what to say. Was this a joke? A game? Or was he serious? Alexander Carter didn't need a housekeeper. He didn't need someone like her. She wasn't qualified. She wasn't trained for this. But there was no mistaking the seriousness in his gaze. The offer was real, and she was being given an opportunity, a chance to step into a world she never thought possible. A world where she wasn't just cleaning up after people, but part of something bigger. something that could change everything for her. "I'll train you," he added, as though reading her thoughts. "There's no catch, just one rule." His eyes darkened slightly. "Don't lie to me." Sophie felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy cloak. The truth was, she had no idea what she was stepping into. She had always lived in the shadows of others' wealth, always cleaned up after the powerful, never once questioning the lives they led. But now, everything was different. Her life was about to change, whether she was ready for it or not. Section 2. The Uncharted Territory. Sophie couldn't remember the last time her heart had been beating this fast. The shock of Alexander's offer was still coursing through her, but now, as she made her way out of the penthouse and into the bustling world of the city below, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. She stepped into the elevator, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. The city was alive outside the windows, the skyscrapers towering above her, each one representing a world that had always seemed distant, a world she had never imagined she could belong to. Yet, here she was, being offered a chance to step inside one of those glittering towers. Sophie's thoughts were a whirlwind as the elevator descended. She had worked countless shifts in this hotel, cleaning rooms, folding towels, making beds, and all the while, the world of the wealthy moved on around her, powerful, untouchable. The CEOs, the millionaires, the people who lived in penthouses and wore tailor suits. People who never noticed her. People who would never care to notice someone like her. But Alexander Carter had noticed. And not only had he noticed, but he had also seen something in her, a quality that made him want to offer her an entirely different life. A life where she would no longer be invisible, no longer just a housekeeper in the background. No. Alexander had just given her a chance to be something else. The question was, what would she do with it? When Sophie reached the lobby, she was met with the usual bustle of guests and hotel staff. But today, it all seemed to blur into the background. She moved mechanically, like a person still trying to wake up from an intense dream. Her mind was too busy processing everything that had just happened. She had told herself for years that she would never get caught up in the world of the rich. She had seen what it did to people, the greed, the manipulation, the constant game of power. But Alexander wasn't like the men she had cleaned up after. He wasn't like the arrogant guests who treated her like she was invisible, as though she was just a part of the background. Alexander had looked at her. He had seen her. He had recognized her worth, even if it was only because she had worked herself to exhaustion. Sophie's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to the present. She fumbled for it, her hands slightly shaky as she pulled it out. It was a message from her landlord, an overdue rent reminder. Sophie sighed, staring at the screen. This was why she had kept working herself into the ground. She had no choice. Rent was due, bills were piling up, and there was never enough money to go around. And now, here she was, with a golden opportunity in front of her. But could she really take it? Her thoughts swirled with uncertainty. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? What if she wasn't cut out for the world Alexandra lived in? Sophie had been a housekeeper for so long that she couldn't even remember a time when she had been anything else. Her life had been one endless string of cleaning, scrubbing, organizing, and maintaining the lives of others. She had become invisible to most people. No one noticed the tired woman behind the mop, the one who kept everything running smoothly while the guests played their high-stakes games in the background. But now, everything had changed. She couldn't avoid the pull of curiosity any longer. What would it be like to step into that world? To be someone who wasn't just trying to survive, but actually living with purpose? Would she be able to handle it, or would she fall back into the shadows where she had always felt comfortable? Sophie didn't have the luxury of indecision. The apartment she lived in was small, cheap, and far from what anyone would call a home. It was a constant reminder of how far she had to go, of how much she had sacrificed just to keep a roof over her head. The thought of continuing down this path, working multiple jobs, struggling to pay her rent, always behind, was too much to bear. She had to take the chance. This was her shot. It wasn't just an opportunity to work for a billionaire. It was a chance to change her life. Sophie pressed her lips together and made her decision. She had to give it everything she had, or she would be stuck in the same cycle forever. The next morning, Sophie woke up early, her heart pounding in her chest. The morning light was barely creeping through the blinds of her apartment, but she had no time to waste. She showered quickly, dressing in the same plain clothes she always wore. But today there was a subtle change in her demeanor. Today she wasn't just Sophie the housekeeper. Today she had agreed to meet Alexander at Carter Enterprises. As she made her way through the busy streets of the city, she couldn't help but notice how different everything seemed. The traffic was louder, the people were moving faster, and the towering buildings felt somehow more intimidating. But Sophie pushed through it, her feet carrying her toward the massive glass doors of the Carter Enterprises headquarters. The lobby was sleek and modern, the floors polished and gleaming. Sophie felt out of place, but she held her head high, keeping her shoulders back as she made her way toward the elevators. The receptionist smiled politely at her, but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sophie was just another face in the crowd, a temporary visitor to this world of wealth and power. When she stepped into the elevator, her heart thudded in her chest. The walls of the elevator were mirrored, and for a moment Sophie caught a glimpse of herself. Her hair was freshly combed, her face slightly flushed from the nerves. She wasn't used to seeing herself like this, prepared, poised, like someone who belonged. As the elevator ascended, Sophie felt her stomach flip. She had no idea what was waiting for her on the top floor. Would she be able to keep up with the high-paced demands of Alexander's world? Would she succeed, or would she fail? The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Sophie stepped out. Her first instinct was to turn and run, but she pushed the thought aside. She had made her decision, and now she had to see it through. The office was pristine, sleek, and modern. It was everything Sophie had expected from someone like Alexander. Perfectly organized, meticulous, and just slightly intimidating. As she entered the room, Alexander was standing by the window, his back to her as he spoke on the phone. He turned when he heard the door close. "You're here," he said, his voice as calm and composed as ever. "Good." Sophie obeyed, sinking into the chair opposite him. Her palms were sweaty, her heart racing, but she held her composure. She was no longer a housekeeper. She was Alexander Carter's new personal assistant, and she was about to step into a world she had only ever dreamed of. But it was no longer a dream. It was her reality. "Let's get to work," Alexander said with a slight smile. Second 3. The price of power. The day started as any other day in the glass-walled office of Alexander Carter, but for Sophie it was different. The air around her seemed thicker, more charged. As she took her seat across from Alexander's imposing desk, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. This was no longer a dream, no longer a fleeting fantasy. Sophie had made her choice, and now she was going to live it, for better or worse. The first few hours passed in a blur. Alexander's world moved at a pace that left Sophie barely able to keep up. His office was filled with calls, messages, decisions, and power moves. The whirlwind of action around her was suffocating, and at times Sophie found herself questioning whether she was really cut out for it. She had been a housekeeper for most of her adult life, her days filled with scrubbing floors and cleaning bathrooms. She had never been in a place where decisions like this had real consequences, where one wrong move could send ripples throughout the entire company. "These numbers need to be on my desk in an hour." Alexander's voice broke through her racing thoughts as he handed her a thick file. Sophie blinked, suddenly realizing that she was expected to keep up. She nodded quickly, her mind already calculating the task ahead. Numbers, data, reports. She had no experience with any of it, but Alexander hadn't given her an option to back down. She hurriedly shuffled through the documents, trying to get a grip on the overwhelming task in front of her. She had only just started her new role, but Alexander's expectations were clear. She would sink or swim, and there was no room for failure. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, her fingers trembling as she flipped through pages filled with terms and numbers she didn't fully understand. Sophie quickly typed up the summary, hoping she had understood everything correctly. She was doing her best to keep up with the rhythm of the office, but it wasn't easy. Alexander's assistant, Miranda, had barely spoken a word to her since she started, giving her no real help or guidance. Sophie was left to figure things out on her own, and the stakes were higher than she had ever experienced. "Is it going?" Alexander asked, his voice calm but sharp. I'm almost done," Sophie said, her voice cracking slightly. She looked up at him, trying to keep the anxiety from showing in her eyes. Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his gaze lingering a little longer than usual. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she knew he wasn't the type to tolerate mistakes. He didn't have time for weaknesses, and in his world, a single misstep could lead to dire consequences. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more measured than before. "Don't worry, Sophie, you'll get the hang of it." Sophie tried to focus on his words, but his calm demeanor didn't comfort her as much as she thought it would. If anything, it made her feel even more out of place. She was now in the midst of a world where power wasn't just about money, it was about control. Alexander's control, and Sophie was still trying to figure out how she fit into the equation. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of meetings, emails, and conference calls. Sophie sat at her desk, watching as Alexander moved between tasks with the grace of someone who had spent his entire life in this world. He was a man who owned everything: his business, his empire, even the very people who worked for him. Sophie had seen it in the way he handled each person who walked into his office. With a single word, he could command them to do his bidding. It was a power that fascinated her, but also terrified her. At one point, Sophie found herself standing in front of a high-ranking investor, delivering a report that Alexander had asked for. Her palms were sweating, her mouth dry, but she did her best to stay composed. As she spoke, she noticed the investor's disinterested gaze, the subtle shift of his weight as he glanced at his phone. Sophie couldn't help but feel like she was being evaluated. Her every word, her every move, was being scrutinized, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep up the act. When the meeting ended, she returned to Alexander's office, her head spinning. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing contracts, looking every bit the powerful CEO he was. Sophie had barely processed what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. She was out of her depth. "You did well today," Alexander said, looking up at her. Sophie froze. Did she? She hadn't felt like she did. She felt like she had been barely treading water, her every move unsure, and now here he was, offering her praise. But was it real, or was it just part of the game? "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice a little unsteady. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. Alexander smiled, the expression almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make Sophie's heart race. "You're going to be fine, Sophie. I know you'll prove yourself," he said, his voice softer now. Sophie nodded, but inside she wasn't sure. She had already given up so much: her time, her energy, her sense of self, and now she was giving her soul to a man who had made it clear that he was never going to stop. Alexander Carter was a man who had everything, and he wanted more. And Sophie? She was just one small piece in his grand puzzle. Later that evening, Sophie sat in her tiny apartment, the city lights outside flickering like distant stars. She didn't have the luxury of a big house or a comfortable life. She had the bare minimum, just enough to survive. She sank onto the worn couch, exhausted from the day's events, but her mind was still racing. Alexander's world was too big, too complicated for her to fully comprehend. She had been thrown into the deep end, and now she had to swim. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Alexander. "Dinner tomorrow. You're coming with me." Sophie stared at the message, her heart pounding. Dinner with Alexander? She had no idea what was expected of her. Was this another test? Was this how things worked in his world? The lines between professional and personal seemed to blur more and more as she spent time with him. But she didn't have time to question it. She had already made her decision. She was going to follow this path no matter where it led. She had to. This was her chance to change everything. The next evening, Sophie arrived at the upscale restaurant where Alexander had reserved a table. The hostess led her to a private room where Alexander was already waiting. His sharp blue eyes met hers as she stepped inside, and for a moment, everything felt too real. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice steady and calm, but there was something in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. He was always in control. Always. Sophie smiled, but it felt forced. "Of course," she replied, taking a seat across from him. The dinner started with the usual small talk, but Sophie could sense there was something more beneath the surface. Alexander was never just doing business. He was always playing a game, one that he was determined to win. As the evening went on, Sophie began to feel more and more out of place. The world Alexander inhabited was filled with people who moved with purpose, people who didn't hesitate to step on others to climb higher. The wealth, the power, the control, it was all around her, pressing in on her. "How are you feeling?" Alexander asked suddenly, his gaze sharp as he watched her. Sophie blinked. "Fine," she replied, but she wasn't sure she was. "Just a little overwhelmed, I guess." He smirked slightly, the corners of his lips curling up. "It's not easy, is it? The world I live in, but it's yours now, Sophie." Sophie swallowed, her throat tight. Was it really? Was this world really hers, or was she just a pawn in Alexander's game? The question gnawed at her, but before she could find an answer, Alexander leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his tone serious. Sophie felt a wave of confusion wash over her. Was he telling the truth, or was he simply using her the way he used everyone around him? The line between friend and foe was quickly becoming impossible to distinguish. But one thing was clear: Sophie was in too deep, and there was no turning back. In Section 4, the fine line between trust and betrayal. Sophie walked back to her tiny apartment that evening, the city lights flickering through the mist as she tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. Dinner with Alexander had been different. There had been something in his eyes, something that made her question the nature of their relationship. Was this just a power play for him? Or was it possible that he truly saw something in her, something worth investing in? But the more Sophie tried to understand Alexander's intentions, the more confused she became. He had made it clear that he had plans for her. He wanted her to rise, to step out of the small world she had known. He saw her potential, but at what cost? She had already sacrificed so much to be here in this world of high stakes and sharp suits. The fear of losing her own identity in this whirlwind made her stomach twist. As Sophie lay in her bed that night, she couldn't escape the feeling that something bigger was unfolding around her. Something she didn't fully understand but was already involved in. Valerie's words from the gala haunted her. "Don't trust Alexander Carter." Sophie had brushed them off then, but now they seemed like a warning. Was Valerie trying to save her, or was she just trying to manipulate her into turning on Alexander? The world Alexander lived in was one of constant strategy and manipulation, and Sophie was caught in the crossfire. She had made her choice. She had committed to this role, to this new life. But the more she learned, the more it seemed like she was dancing on the edge of a knife. The next morning was no different. Alexander's office felt colder than usual as Sophie entered, her heart still heavy from the events of the night before. She had barely slept, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Could she really trust him? Could she trust anyone in this high-powered world? "Good morning, Sophie." Alexander's voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have a lot to get through today." Sophie nodded, trying to push the lingering unease from her mind. "What's on the agenda?" Alexander flipped open his schedule on the desk, scanning it quickly before looking up at her. "We have a meeting with Sinclair Industries at 10. Be prepared. I need a full briefing on their latest acquisitions." Sophie took a deep breath. Sinclair Industries was one of Alexander's biggest competitors, and their CEO, Valerie Sinclair, was a woman with a reputation for ruthless business tactics. Sophie had already heard whispers about her from both Alexander and others, and the tension between the two women was palpable. She had no idea what Alexander expected her to do in the meeting, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She grabbed the files from the desk and began to read through them quickly. The numbers, the figures, the names, nothing made sense to her yet, but it was clear that this meeting would be a critical one. An hour later, Sophie stood beside Alexander as they entered the conference room. The moment they walked in, all eyes were on them. The room was filled with high-level executives, all talking in low voices, their gazes shifting between Alexander and Sophie. As she took her seat at the table, Sophie felt the weight of the room's scrutiny. They were all watching her now, waiting to see what kind of assistant Alexander had brought with him. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to keep her focus. This wasn't about her, it was about the deal. She had to get this right. She had to impress Alexander. "Let's get to it," Alexander said, his voice cold and commanding as he addressed the room. Sophie remained silent as he took control of the meeting, her eyes flicking from one executive to another. She could feel the tension building as Alexander and the representatives from Sinclair Industries began to discuss their latest venture. The conversation quickly turned to Sinclair's latest acquisition, a major tech firm. The deal was worth billions, and Alexander's tone became sharper, more demanding. It was clear that he wasn't going to let anyone outmaneuver him. Sophie could barely keep up with the technical jargon being thrown around, but she knew this was important. This was the moment where everything would either fall into place or crumble. She scribbled down notes, trying to pick up any details that might be important. As the meeting progressed, Alexander's gaze kept flicking to her. There was a sense of expectation in his eyes, a silent demand for her to contribute. Sophie felt a knot tighten in her chest. She couldn't just sit there and watch. She had to prove herself, to show that she wasn't just a secretary, but a vital part of his operation. "Miss Bennett," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "What's your opinion on Sinclair's strategy?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. All eyes were now on her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind raced as she scrambled to put together a coherent thought. She was drowning in a sea of data, and she had no lifeline to grab onto. Then, suddenly, something clicked. She remembered the files she had studied earlier, the details about Sinclair's acquisition, the gaps in their strategy. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "They're overestimating their ability to integrate the new technology. The company they acquired has a history of poor management and high turnover. If they don't address this issue soon, the entire acquisition could implode," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline racing through her veins. The room fell silent. For a moment, no one spoke. Alexander's eyes were fixed on her, his expression unreadable. Sophie waited, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that she hadn't just made a mistake. Finally, Alexander nodded. "Well said, Sophie," he said, his tone colder than before. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of approval. "We'll have to watch Sinclair closely. Thank you." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Sophie barely remembered what happened next, but as they left the room, she could feel Alexander's gaze on her again, this time softer, more appraising. "You did well," he said, his voice low. "But don't get comfortable. This is just the beginning." Sophie nodded, but inside she was still reeling. She had done it, she had survived the meeting, but the victory felt hollow. She had proven herself, yes, but at what cost? Later that evening, Sophie found herself back at her apartment, exhausted and drained. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Alexander. "Dinner tomorrow, you'll be joining me at a charity gala." Sophie stared at the message, her stomach sinking. A gala? She had no idea how to navigate these events. But she knew one thing. It wasn't just a social gathering. It was another test. And she was about to step deeper into Alexander's world, a world that promised power, but at the price of everything she had ever known. Section 5. The Charity Gala. A world beyond her reach. Sophie sat at her small kitchen table, the soft hum of the city drifting through her apartment as she stared at the message from Alexander. "Dinner tomorrow. You'll be joining me at a charity gala." The words echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of foreboding. She had no idea what to expect, but one thing was clear. This was not going to be an ordinary dinner. This was another step into a world she didn't belong in. She could already feel the tension building in her chest. The world Alexander Carter lived in was filled with glitz and glamour. High society events where people measured their worth by the brand of their suit or the sparkle of their diamonds. She had never been a part of that world. Her entire life had been about survival. Working multiple shifts, scraping by to make rent, barely able to keep her head above water. Now, Alexander wanted her to step into his world, and she wasn't sure she was ready. The night before the gala, Sophie tossed and turned in her bed, her mind racing. What was expected of her? What role was she supposed to play? She had never been to an event like this, and the thought of walking into a room full of people who looked like they belonged there, while she felt like an outsider, made her stomach churn. But she couldn't back out. She had made a choice. She was in this now, and there was no turning back. The next morning, she met with Miranda, Alexander's former assistant, who had been assigned to help Sophie get ready for the evening. Miranda's cool, professional demeanor did nothing to ease Sophie's nerves. She had barely spoken to Sophie since she started, and now, as she handed her a sleek black dress, she simply said, "You'll wear this tonight. It's important that you look the part. Stick to the script. Don't make a scene." Sophie nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took the dress. She had never worn anything like it before. Soft silk that clung to her in all the right places, accentuating the curves she usually kept hidden. As she stood in front of the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The woman staring back at her wasn't the one who spent her days cleaning rooms and scrubbing floors. She was someone else entirely, someone who had no place in this world of power and wealth. But this was the role she had to play if she wanted to survive. At 6:00 p.m., a black car pulled up outside her apartment. The driver, a quiet man named Grant, opened the door for her. She slipped inside, the weight of her decision heavy in her chest. As they drove through the city, Sophie's mind kept replaying the conversations she had with Alexander. He had seen something in her, but what was it? And why was he offering her a chance at a life she didn't know how to navigate? The car pulled up to a grand venue. The building, a towering structure of marble and glass, gleamed under the city lights. Sophie felt a wave of anxiety hit her as they stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The doorman opened the massive doors, revealing a lobby filled with guests in designer suits and gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of hushed conversations. Sophie felt her pulse quicken as she stepped into the ballroom, the sound of soft music filling the space. She looked around at the sea of well-dressed men and women, each one more polished and poised than she could ever hope to be. As they moved further into the room, her anxiety spiked. She didn't belong here, but she had no choice. She had to be a part of this world, whether she liked it or not. Alexander appeared at her side, his tall figure cutting through the crowd like a predator on the hunt. His presence commanded attention, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room as if he owned it. He was a man who knew how to control everything around him, except for Sophie. Sophie, with her unpolished edges and raw honesty, was the one thing he couldn't easily shake. "You look stunning," Alexander said, his voice low and smooth as he turned to her. Sophie forced a smile, feeling the weight of the moment. She had no idea how to respond. The world they were in was alien to her, and she felt like an imposter in the most expensive clothes she had ever worn. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander led her through the crowd, introducing her to a number of guests. Businessmen, investors, and high-profile individuals filled the room, all exchanging pleasantries and making deals with the flick of a wrist. Sophie couldn't help but feel out of place as she stood next to Alexander, his commanding presence making it difficult to blend in. But it wasn't long before she noticed Valerie Sinclair across the room, her tall blonde figure impossible to miss. She was surrounded by men, laughing and chatting in a way that made Sophie feel small. Valerie's eyes locked onto Sophie's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Valerie's lips curled into a smirk, and Sophie's heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking her. Valerie knew exactly who Sophie was, and she had no intention of making things easy. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, before Alexander's voice broke through her thought. "Come," he said, his tone firm. "Let's talk business." He guided her to a quieter area of the room, away from the chaos. As they walked, Sophie tried to shake the feeling that Valerie's eyes were still on her, that Valerie was watching her every move. The discomfort only grew as they sat down at a small table in the corner of the room. "Are you okay?" Alexander asked, his gaze softening as he looked at her. Sophie hesitated. Was she okay? She didn't know anymore. This world was so far beyond anything she had ever known. But she had made her choice. She was here, and she had to keep going. "I'm fine," she replied, trying to sound convincing. Alexander studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. "You don't have to pretend, Sophie. If this isn't what you want, you can walk away." But Sophie wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. She had come this far, and the opportunity to change her life was right in front of her. But was it worth it? Was it worth stepping deeper into this world of wealth and power, where everyone had something to gain and everyone was playing a game? She had no answers, only uncertainty, and as the night wore on, Sophie knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. She was standing at the precipice, caught between two worlds, and one wrong move could change everything. The gala, with its glittering lights and masked faces, had become more than just an event. It had become a battlefield, and Sophie was standing in the middle of it, unsure of which side she was on. Would she become part of this world, or would she be crushed under its weight? Only time would tell. Excited for the test. The test? A betrayal in the making. The night after the gala, Sophie lay awake in her small apartment, the hum of the city below almost too much to bear. Her mind replayed every moment, the glances exchanged, the tension with Valerie, and most of all, Alexander's commanding presence. There was no denying it anymore. She was deep into a world that demanded more from her than she had ever imagined. Valerie's warning kept echoing in her mind. Don't trust Alexander Carter. Was she just another pawn in his game? Or was Valerie simply trying to protect her own position? Sophie's phone buzzed on her nightstand. A message from Alexander. "Meet me in my office, we need to talk." The text was short, direct, as if nothing had happened the night before, as if she hadn't felt the weight of the decisions hanging over her. She sighed, glancing at the clock. It was already past 7 in the morning, and the day ahead promised to be no less demanding than the one before. A quick shower, a hurried breakfast, and then she was on her way to Carter Enterprises, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach. Sophie walked through the sleek glass doors of the building, the sound of her heels clicking loudly on the polished marble floors. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy surfaces as she passed, a woman in an expensive black dress who felt like an imposter in this high-rise world of power and business. Grant, the driver, was waiting for her outside the elevator, and as she got into the car, he offered a curt nod before driving her to the familiar penthouse. The car ride felt longer than usual, her thoughts racing, but it was too early for questions. What was Alexander going to say? What would happen next? She was about to find out. As the elevator doors opened to the top floor, Sophie was greeted by the usual, pristine, high-end atmosphere. The large windows, stretching from floor to ceiling, provided a breathtaking view of the city. Alexander was already waiting for her in his office, standing by the window, the bright morning light casting long shadows across the room. He didn't immediately acknowledge her presence, and for a moment, Sophie stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of him. He was the picture of control, his posture straight, eyes focused on the horizon, as if waiting for the world to move around him. When he finally turned, his sharp blue eyes met hers. "You're early," he said, his voice neutral, though Sophie could feel a slight tension in the air. "Is everything okay?" she asked hesitantly. He studied her for a moment, then waved toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit," he said. Sophie moved to the chair, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Alexander's eyes remained on her as he slowly took his seat behind his desk. He exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "I need you to handle something for me," he began. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Sophie couldn't ignore. "Of course," she replied, bracing herself for what he was about to ask. He slid a manila folder across the desk toward her. "I need you to attend a high-stakes meeting this afternoon. You'll be meeting with a few key figures from Sinclair Industries." Sophie blinked, surprised. "But I know," he interrupted, raising a hand. "I know you don't have experience in this kind of thing, but you've proven yourself capable so far, and you'll have the backup you need." Her mind raced. The gravity of the situation was clear. This was no simple task. A meeting with Sinclair Industries? She had heard of them. They were one of the largest conglomerates in the country, and a rival to Alexander's business. "But what about the reports?" Sophie asked, trying to buy herself some time. "I'm still learning how everything works around here." "That's the point," Alexander said coolly. "I need you to do more than take notes. I need you to observe, to listen carefully. People in this industry say a lot without saying anything at all. You need to learn how to read between the lines." Sophie's pulse quickened. He was asking her to dive deeper into this world than she had ever anticipated. She wasn't sure she was ready for this kind of responsibility. But then again, what choice did she have? She had already agreed to be his personal assistant, and with each passing day, it felt like there was no turning back. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he focused on her. "Sophie, you need to trust me, and I need you to do this, because the stakes are high, and your involvement is crucial." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Sophie felt the weight of the decision bearing down on her. Trust him, trust Alexander. But could she? Was he really giving her this responsibility because he believed in her? Or was he simply playing a game, using her as a pawn in his plans? Before she could respond, Alexander stood up, walking to the window once again. He stared out at the city, his back to her. "I know this is a lot to ask," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but you've already shown me that you're capable. I need you to prove that you're more than just a housekeeper. You have the potential to make a real impact here." Sophie swallowed hard, trying to push down the uncertainty that rose in her chest. She had spent years surviving, doing whatever it took to get by. But now, in this world of high-stakes business and power plays, survival wasn't enough. She had to choose a side, and that meant more than just being a passive participant in Alexander's world. And she had to play by his rules. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady, even though her hands trembled slightly. Alexander turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Good. I'm glad you understand. You'll be briefed on everything you need to know, but I expect you to be ready for anything. This is your chance to show what you're truly capable of." Sophie nodded, her mind racing with the implications of what was to come. She wasn't sure what she was getting herself into, but she knew one thing. This was her moment to prove herself, to make a choice. Alexander's eyes softened slightly. "Go, get ready. The meeting is in 2 hours." Sophie stood, her legs slightly unsteady beneath her. She walked out of the office, her mind swirling with questions. What had she just agreed to, and what did Alexandra really want from her? The answer, she realized, would reveal itself soon enough, and with each passing moment she felt herself being drawn deeper into a game she didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear, there was no going back now. Sophie left the penthouse with her heart pounding in her chest. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. This was no longer just a job. She was no longer just the housekeeper turned assistant. She was a player in a game where the stakes were high and trust was in short supply. As she made her way to the meeting, Sophie realized something important. This was not just about surviving anymore. This was about becoming something more. And in that moment, she wasn't sure whether she was ready for it. But she had no choice. Her life was about to change, and she could feel it with every step she took. Section 7. The Unexpected Challenge. Sophie stood in front of the mirrored elevator doors, taking in her reflection for what felt like the 100th time. The dress, the one Alexander's assistant Miranda had picked out for her, was beautiful, sleek, black, and simple, but it made her feel like she didn't belong in the world she was about to step into. She wasn't used to this world, the world of tailored suits, high-end fashion, and businessmen who spoke in sharp, calculated sentences. And tonight, she was walking straight into the heart of it. Tonight, everything would change. The elevator doors slid open, and the rush of cool, conditioned air from the lobby met her skin. Sophie adjusted her dress one last time, a silent prayer that she wouldn't embarrass herself tonight. She had been given a task, an important one: attend the charity gala on Alexander's behalf. Observe, listen, report back, he had said. But she didn't feel like an observer, not anymore. As she stepped into the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, the lights above shimmered like diamonds, casting a soft glow on the hundreds of glittering gowns and sharply dressed men. The laughter and clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, but Sophie felt detached, as though she were on the outside, looking in. She tried her best to hold her own as she moved through the crowd, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor. It was clear that she was out of her element, but she kept her chin high, reminding herself that she was here for a reason. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She wasn't just Alexander's assistant. She had a purpose now, and that purpose was bigger than anything she could have imagined. Sophie spotted Alexander across the room, engaged in conversation with several well-dressed men, their postures commanding and their voices low and deliberate. She didn't approach him, though. She was here to blend in, to observe, to gather information. The mission Alexander had given her weighed heavily on her mind as she moved through the crowd. She took a deep breath, adjusting the small, discreet earpiece Alexander had given her, knowing he would be listening in. He wanted her to gather information on Sinclair Industries, what Valerie Sinclair was planning, what Jonathan Pierce was hiding. Sophie had been briefed, but it was one thing to read about something and another to be in the thick of it. She had no idea what she was really walking into. Then, as if the universe had decided to throw her a curveball, she saw her, Valerie Sinclair, standing near the bar, her tall figure glowing under the dim lights, exuding an air of effortless power. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and the red dress she wore clung to her figure like it was custom-made. She was everything Sophie wasn't: elegant, poised, untouchable. But Sophie wasn't here for comparisons. She was here to gather information. Valerie caught Sophie's eye from across the room, and Sophie froze for a moment, her stomach twisting. She had heard the whispers, seen the way the staff in Carter Enterprises regarded Valerie. There was something about her that made people uncomfortable. A powerful woman, but with a sharp, dangerous edge. A woman who had once been Alexander's lover, and Sophie wasn't sure if she could trust her. Valerie smiled at her, a slow, knowing smile, and it made Sophie's skin prickle. Without a word, Valerie started walking toward her, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. "New girl, right?" Valerie's voice was smooth, almost purring. Sophie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Ah, yes," Sophie replied, swallowing. "I'm Sophie. I'm here for Alexander." Valerie's smile widened, though it didn't reach her cold eyes. "Of course you are." She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "It must be quite the change for you, stepping from housekeeping to working for the CEO himself. A lot of pressure, don't you think?" Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, just loud enough for Sophie to hear. "I hope you're prepared for what's to come." Sophie's pulse quickened, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I'm not afraid of a challenge." Valerie's laugh was soft but knowing. "I'm sure you're not, but you'll soon learn that Alexander Carter doesn't care about you, Sophie. Not really. He's playing a game, and in his world, you're just a pawn. Don't say I didn't warn you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the rumors, but hearing them from Valerie Sinclair's lips made it all feel much more real. Sophie tried to hide the unease creeping into her chest, but Valerie didn't miss the way her shoulders tensed. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Valerie said, her smile a little too sweet. "I'm not here to make things hard for you. I'm just giving you some advice." Her eyes glinted. "You don't need to prove anything. Alexander has already made his choice." Sophie took a step back, her mind racing. What did Valerie mean by that? What was she trying to tell her, and why was she being so cryptic? Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't want to show any weakness in front of her. "I'm just doing my job," Sophie said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Valerie's eyes flickered with something akin to amusement. "Your job, huh? Well, let me remind you, Sophie, you're not just a secretary. You're a pawn in a game much bigger than you can even imagine. Just remember, I'm always watching." With that, Valerie turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing alone in the middle of the room, her thoughts a whirlwind. She knew she was caught in a game, caught between two worlds, each pulling her in different directions. Alexander had chosen her. Valerie had warned her. But the question that kept gnawing at her wasn't whether she could survive this world. It was whether... Sophie didn't know the answer, but she knew one thing for sure. This night, this dinner, had just become more complicated than she ever expected. The lines between right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, had blurred, and Sophie was no longer sure where she stood. As the night wore on, Sophie found herself lost in a sea of unfamiliar faces, the weight of Valerie's words pressing heavily on her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was one thing she hadn't considered. She wasn't just playing a game of power. She was playing a game for her future, for the life she wanted. And tonight, everything she did would decide how that life unfolded. Exception 8. The Crossroads of Trust. The morning after the gala, Sophie felt as though her head was still spinning. The glitz and glamour of the event had been replaced by the stark, corporate world of Carter Enterprises. But despite the pristine, polished surfaces of the building and the glimmering lights of her new position, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty gnawing at her. She hadn't just been at a party, she had been at the epicenter, and yet here she was, standing in Alexander's office, trying to piece together the puzzle of who to trust in this high-stakes world. As she stepped into the sleek office, the air felt thick with tension. Alexander was already sitting at his desk, the dim morning light spilling through the windows behind him, casting shadows on his sharp features. His eyes were intense, piercing into the screen of his laptop. He barely looked up when she entered, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. But he didn't speak. Sophie hesitated, unsure of what her next move should be. It was as if every time she thought she knew what she was doing, the ground shifted beneath her feet. The silence stretched between them for a moment before Alexander finally looked up. "You look like you didn't sleep well," he commented, his voice low and laced with an unreadable edge. Sophie forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, just adjusting to the new routine." He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I hope you didn't let last night's events get to you. It's a game, Sophie, and you need to learn how to play it." She swallowed hard. The night had been a blur of secrets and whispers. Valerie's words had been a constant echo in her mind since then. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice, but when she thought about it, she knew she didn't have many options. Alexander had given her an opportunity to change her life, to get out of the life she had been scraping through, and in some ways, that terrified her. "I don't want to play any games," Sophie said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just want to do my job, do it well, and get out of this alive." Alexander's lips quirked up in the slightest smile, as if amused by her defiance. "That's what I like about you. You think you're just here to do your job, but you're already deeper in this world than you think." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. "Do you know how many people want to be where you are right now? How many people would kill to be by my side, to have this chance?" Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating her for a moment. Was she just a pawn in his game? Or was this an opportunity for her to make her own decisions, to forge her own path? She wasn't sure anymore. "Forget what I'm just telling you to do, Alexander," she finally said, her voice trembling just a little despite her best efforts to remain calm. He exhaled slowly, as if the question had been inevitable. "I'm asking you to prove that you can trust me. Trust is a currency in this world, Sophie. It's the only thing that matters." His gaze hardened, turning cold. "And it's the only thing that separates us from everyone else who's trying to manipulate the situation for their own benefit." Her heart raced in her chest. She couldn't deny the truth in his words. Valerie had warned her about Alexander. He played people like pawns. He controlled them. But was it really different from what Valerie had done? She had her own agenda. She had her own stake in this game. Who was she supposed to trust? Who was the real villain here? "Is that all you want from me? Trust?" Sophie asked, her voice steady despite the maelstrom of thoughts in her mind. Alexander's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment she saw something in his gaze that wasn't power or control. Something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "No, I don't just want your trust, Sophie," he said, his voice low. "I want you to stand by me. I want you to be loyal. You'll never get to the top by being weak. Loyalty, trust, and strength, those are the things I value." Sophie was quiet, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. The life she had been struggling to escape was suddenly within reach, but with it came the price of loyalty, the price of trust. It was all a gamble, and Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready to play. Before she could speak, Alexander stood, walking over to the large windows that looked out over the city. The light from the morning sun bathed the room in a soft golden hue, but Sophie couldn't find any comfort in it. The silence between them was palpable, heavy with the tension of unspoken questions and unasked answers. "I need you to do something for me," Alexander said, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but Sophie could see the underlying determination in his eyes. "I want you to go to the board meeting tomorrow. You'll sit in on it, listen to everything, take notes. Report back to me. There's a leak in the company, Sophie, and I need to know who's behind it." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. A leak? In Carter Enterprises? That wasn't something she had expected to hear. But before she could speak, Alexander added, "You'll be my eyes and ears, Sophie. If you do this right, you'll prove that I can trust you. And if you prove that, you'll have more power than you can imagine." She stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. She had already crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "I'll do it," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Alexander's lips curled into a small approving smile. "Good. You're starting to understand the rules. Now, get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." As Sophie left the office, the door clicking shut behind her, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. She had trusted Alexander, but how much of it was true? How much of this world was a game she wasn't prepared for? She didn't know the answer, but what she did know was that she had no choice but to play. Section 9. The Price of Loyalty. The sun had barely begun to rise over the city as Sophie made her way to Carter Enterprises. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, doubts, and anticipation. She had agreed to attend the board meeting for Alexander, but as she stood in front of the imposing glass building, the weight of her decision felt heavier than ever. She had stepped into a world of high stakes, one that she wasn't sure she was ready for, but she didn't have the luxury of second-guessing herself anymore. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like the slowest one of her life. As the doors opened, Sophie was met with the cool, impersonal atmosphere of the executive floor. The sleek, modern design was intimidating, and the hush of the office reminded her that she was stepping into the heart of power, a place where decisions were made that affected millions. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was someone's spy, someone's tool. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her back and walked down the hallway toward the conference room. She was early, but Alexander had made it clear that punctuality was critical. As she reached the door, she could hear the low murmur of voices inside, executives discussing their agenda, their plans, their world. It was a world Sophie had never known. When the door opened, she was greeted with the sight of the boardroom, sleek, polished, and cold, just like the people inside it. They were all dressed in suits, their expressions hardened in concentration, none of them acknowledging her presence as she entered. The only person who seemed to notice her was Alexander. He was standing at the head of the table, his back to her, but as soon as she entered, he turned, his gaze meeting hers across the room. "Mr. Bennett, you're just in time," he said, his voice calm and commanding, as if she had been part of this world all along. His words carried authority, and Sophie felt the weight of his eyes on her as she walked toward her designated seat beside him. The room fell into a brief silence as she took her seat. Sophie had never felt more out of place in her life. The executives around the table were all sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued. They spoke in fast, clipped sentences, each word calculated for maximum impact. Sophie barely understood half of the jargon they used, but she nodded along, trying her best to blend in and not show how much she was struggling to keep up. As the meeting progressed, Sophie couldn't help but notice the tension in the room. Everyone was on edge, their eyes flicking toward Alexander every few seconds as he spoke. He was in control, as always, but there was something different about him today. He seemed more intense, more focused, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder, was this just another business meeting, or was it something more? Was she part of something far more dangerous than she had realized? Suddenly, Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts. "Miss Bennett," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, his expression unreadable. "Could you take a note on this?" Sophie blinked, startled by the sudden attention. "Of course," she stammered, grabbing her pen and notebook. He gave her a small nod and turned back to the table, and Sophie quickly scribbled down his request. But the words on the page felt like nothing more than scribbles in a world she couldn't quite understand. As the meeting went on, she couldn't help but feel like a spectator in her own life. She was here because Alexander had given her this chance, but why? What did he really want from her? And more importantly, what did she want? By the time the meeting ended, Sophie's mind was swimming. Alexander had handled the meeting with his usual smooth, effortless grace, but Sophie could see the undercurrent of something darker, something that made the air in the room heavy with unspoken tension. As the executives filed out, Alexander stayed behind, his gaze lingering on Sophie. "You did well," he said, his voice low. His words were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't expected. "You kept up." Sophie couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a test. "Thank you," she replied, unsure of what else to say. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "This business isn't for everyone," he continued, his tone turning more serious. "It's cutthroat and it's relentless. But if you want to make it here, Sophie, you need to be sharp. You need to think like a predator, not prey." The words struck her like a punch. She wasn't sure if he was speaking to her as his assistant or as someone he saw as a potential rival. Was she part of his plan, or was she just a pawn in his game? "I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "You will," he replied, his eyes searching hers. "You'll understand the price of loyalty soon enough. and you'll also understand the price of betrayal." Sophie shivered slightly at the coldness in his voice. She had seen a side of Alexander today that made her wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. He was powerful, ruthless, and calculated, but was he also capable of loyalty? Or was everything just a transaction to him? She wasn't sure anymore. "Now," Alexander said, standing up and straightening his jacket, "I need you to do something for me. There's a gala tonight, a charity event. I want you to go, observe, and take note of anything that seems off." Sophie blinked, taken aback. "A gala?" she repeated, feeling the unease building in her chest. "But—" "No questions," he interrupted, his voice firm. "You'll be there, and you'll report back. You'll see what I'm dealing with. It's important, Sophie. Trust me." The weight of his words hung in the air. Sophie nodded slowly, though she had no idea what she was stepping into. But one thing was clear. Alexander wasn't just asking for her help. He was giving her a mission, and if she succeeded, it would prove her loyalty. But if she failed, she would pay the price. She felt like a pawn again, but this time, she wasn't sure if she was playing the game or if the game was playing her. "Of course, Mr. Carter," Sophie said, the words slipping from her lips automatically. She had no choice, not anymore. As she walked out of his office, the weight of her decision settled over her like a heavy cloak. The gala was just another test, another opportunity for Alexander to gauge her worth. And Sophie knew that no matter what happened, she would have to make a choice. The question was, which side would she choose? And when the dust settled, would she still be standing? The night loomed ahead, dark and uncertain, and Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready to face what was about to come. But there was no turning back now. The game had begun, and she was already deep in the middle of it. And Section 10. The choice that defines everything. The night of the gala arrived far too quickly for Sophie's comfort. She had barely processed what had happened during the board meeting, the stark conversations with Alexander, or even the unsettling warning from Valerie Sinclair. But now, as she stood before the full-length mirror in her modest apartment, she couldn't escape the reality of it. The sleek black dress she wore felt foreign against her skin. It was beautiful, no doubt, courtesy of Alexander's assistant Miranda, who had pulled a few strings to make sure Sophie looked presentable. The dress was simple but elegant, hugging her figure in all the right places. But to Sophie, it felt like a costume, a uniform she was expected to wear, a role she was supposed to play. A role she wasn't sure she wanted to be in. She hadn't asked for this life. She didn't ask to be thrust into the inner circles of the wealthy elite, to be a pawn in a game of power and control. Yet here she was, walking the fine line between loyalty and betrayal, between survival and self-destruction. With a deep breath, Sophie grabbed her purse, checking the tiny recording device inside, and made her way to the car that awaited her outside. The driver, Grant, didn't speak as they made their way through the city streets, the bright lights outside the window blurring into a whirlwind of colors. Sophie's thoughts were elsewhere, swirling with questions about the life she was stepping into. She had been given an opportunity, but what price would she have to pay for it? She couldn't help but think of Valerie's warning. "Don't trust Alexander Carter, he's dangerous." The words echoed in her mind, and though Sophie tried to shake them off, she couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt in her chest. Alexander's world was one of manipulation, power, and secrets. But was he truly as bad as Valerie had painted him? Or was Valerie just trying to turn Sophie against him? The car came to a stop outside a grand hotel. Sophie stepped out, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she entered the lavish ballroom. The gala was already in full swing, with guests mingling, sipping champagne, and exchanging business cards. The atmosphere was a blend of wealth, influence, and ambition. It was the world Sophie had only ever witnessed from the outside, but tonight she was part of it. Or at least she was supposed to be. Her heart pounded as she walked through the crowd, feeling like an imposter among the polished suits and glittering gowns. She caught glimpses of people whispering behind their hands, exchanging sly glances as they assessed the newcomers. But Sophie wasn't there to blend in. She was there to observe, to report back to Alexander, to give him whatever information she could gather. She spotted Valerie Sinclair almost immediately. The tall blonde was surrounded by a small group of men, her laugh melodic and charming as always. But there was something different about her tonight. Her eyes flickered briefly in Sophie's direction, and for a moment their gazes locked. Sophie didn't flinch, but she felt the weight of Valerie's scrutiny. The silent challenge in her eyes was unmistakable, and Sophia knew she had to play her part. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to survive. Taking a deep breath, she made her way toward the bar. She could feel the tension building in her chest as she kept her eyes trained on Valerie. As the minutes ticked by, Sophie tried to focus on the task at hand. She had to gather information. She had to be careful. This wasn't just a social event. It was a battlefield, one where loyalty could shift in an instant. A few moments later, Valerie excused herself from the group and walked toward the bar, where Sophie was standing. She smiled when she saw Sophie, the expression coldly pleasant. "Sophie, darling," Valerie purred, her voice oozing with honeyed sweetness. "You're looking, well, different tonight." Sophie forced a smile, the back of her mind racing. "Thank you, Miss Sinclair, you look lovely as always." Valerie chuckled, the sound low and teasing. "Please, call me Valerie. We're practically colleagues now, aren't we?" Sophie didn't respond immediately. She had to tread carefully. Valerie was a master at playing mind games, and Sophie wasn't about to fall into her trap. She took a slow sip of her champagne, letting the bubbles settle in her stomach as she observed Valerie closely. "You're new to this world, aren't you?" Valerie continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't quite belong here, Sophie." Sophie's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just doing my job." Valerie smirked. "That's the problem, darling. You think it's just a job. But in this world, everything is personal. Alexander isn't just your boss, he's your master. And you're nothing more than a tool to him." Sophie's chest tightened at the venom in Valerie's voice, but she didn't flinch. She had heard enough about Valerie's history with Alexander to know she was just bitter. But there was a seed of doubt being planted in Sophie's mind. Was Valerie right? Was she just a pawn in a game she didn't understand? And if she was, what kind of game was Alexander playing? Before Sophie could respond, Valerie leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Let me give you some advice, Sophie. Be careful who you trust. Alexander Carter isn't what he seems. He's a liar, a manipulator, and he'll use you until you're no longer useful. And when that time comes, he'll toss you aside without a second thought." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, but she stood her ground. "Thank you for the warning," she said, her voice cool and even, "but I don't need your advice." Valerie's smile widened, and for a moment, Sophie saw something dark flicker in her eyes. "You will," Valerie replied softly. "You'll need it more than you think." Sophie didn't know how to respond to that. She had no idea what Valerie's game was, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this woman, this dangerous woman, control her. She wasn't going to let anyone control her. As Valerie walked away, Sophie turned her attention back to the task at hand. She had a mission. She had to stay focused. She had to be the one to control the narrative. And if that meant playing Valerie's game, then so be it. The evening passed in a blur of conversations, half-formed alliances, and subtle manipulations. Sophie's mind was reeling as she collected what little information she could. She had seen enough to know that there was a battle brewing between Alexander and Valerie, but who was truly the villain in this story? Was it Valerie with her bitter resentment and manipulative tactics? Or was it Alexander, the man who had taken Sophie from her humble life and thrust her into a world of power and deceit? She couldn't make sense of it all. She couldn't decide who was right and who was wrong. But one thing was certain. Sophie was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a player in this dangerous game, and whether she liked it or not, she was going to have to make a choice. As the gala came to a close, Sophie stepped outside into the cool night air. The city stretched before her, a sprawling web of opportunity and danger, and in the distance, she could see the faint glow of her future, one stacked with self-improvement success and more treacherous than she could have ever imagined. But as she stood there, her heart racing, she knew one thing for sure. She had to survive, and to do that, she would have to be willing to sacrifice everything. The game was just beginning, and Sophie had just made her first move. The price of power and the price of trust. The days after the gala felt like a whirlwind. Sophie had returned to her modest apartment, her mind spinning with all that had transpired. The truth had started to settle in. She had crossed a line. The choices she made now would define her future, not just in the world of high-profile CEOs and billion-dollar empires, but in her own sense of self-worth. Alexander Carter's world was intoxicating. It was a world where power was currency, and every decision carried the weight of millions. Sophie had known from the start that she wasn't supposed to belong here, but now, as his personal assistant, she was not just a bystander. She was in the middle of it all. But the deeper she got into his world, the harder it was to distinguish between who she was working for and who she was becoming. She had been given a chance, a golden opportunity to escape her life of exhaustion and struggle. She had been handpicked by Alexander, a man who saw something in her beyond her role as a housekeeper. It was a chance most people could only dream of, but now Sophie felt the weight of what that meant. Was she truly making a choice for herself, or was she just another pawn in a game she didn't understand? The decision to follow through with Alexander's request, to spy on Valerie Sinclair, to get close to her and learn her secrets, had been a turning point. In that moment, Sophie had crossed into a world where trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal lurked in every corner. But Alexander had made her an offer, one she couldn't refuse. The power in his world came at a price, and Sophie knew, deep down, that she had to prove herself. She had to earn her place in this game. The following week had passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and endless work. Alexander had been colder than usual, the silent distance between them growing with every passing hour. He no longer looked at her with the same curiosity. Instead, there was an air of expectation. He expected her to perform, to meet every challenge without question. It was the price she paid for this opportunity. But as the days wore on, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself. She was no longer just Sophie Bennett, the tired housekeeper scraping by to make rent. She had become Sophie Turner, personal assistant to Alexander Carter, a woman walking a fine line between ambition and betrayal. She had done what Alexander asked. She had spied on Valerie, collected the information, and handed it over. The result? Valerie's reputation had crumbled, and her influence was now a distant memory. Alexander had won, but had Sophie? She stood in Alexandria's penthouse suite one evening, staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched before her, a glowing labyrinth of opportunity. She had everything she'd ever dreamed of: money, status, a future with a man who could offer her anything. But none of it mattered, not when the emptiness lingered in her chest, gnawing at her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A text message from Alexander. "Meet me in my office, we need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. Every time he summoned her, it felt like a test she had no choice but to take. She walked into his office, her steps measured and deliberate. He was already there, his eyes trained on the city below as if nothing had changed. He didn't acknowledge her presence until she cleared her throat softly. When his eyes met hers, Sophie saw something different. Something colder. "You did well, Sophie," he said, his voice smooth, but there was no warmth behind it. "You've proven yourself." Sophie nodded, but her mind was racing. "I did what you asked, but now you're part of this world," he interrupted, his gaze hardening. "And this world doesn't stop. You made your choice." Sophie swallowed, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had made her choice, but now, standing before him, she realized just how much it had cost her. Alexander stepped closer, his presence overwhelming as always. "You've learned to play the game, Sophie. Now you need to keep playing, for your own survival." Her chest tightened. Survival. That was what this had all been about, wasn't it? She had chosen survival over everything else, over her morals, over her integrity, even over her peace of mind. "Will you ever trust me?" Sophie asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Trust doesn't matter here. Power does." The words stung. Sophie knew deep down that Alexander was right. In his world, trust was a fleeting illusion. Power was everything, and if Sophie wanted to remain in his world, she would have to play by his rules. She nodded slowly, resigned to the truth. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. She was no longer the same woman who had fallen asleep on the couch in his penthouse suite. She was someone else now, someone who had made her peace with the sacrifices necessary to survive in Alexander's world. But as Sophie walked out of his office that evening, she realized one thing. No matter how much power Alexander held, or how much she had learned to navigate his world, there was one thing he couldn't control: her heart. And as she left the building, a quiet decision formed in her mind. It was time to make her own path, to take what she had learned and find her own way forward. Alexander's world might have been powerful, but Sophie knew that the real power lay in her ability to make choices, not just for survival, but for her own happiness. And she was ready to claim it. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. And Sophie was no longer afraid. She had everything to lose, but she also had everything to gain. The future was hers to shape, and this time she would do it on her own terms.